The lawyer looked across the table at my son, folded his hands slowly, and asked a question I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Mr. Caldwell, before we proceed, did you actually read the full document? Every page?" My son laughed. He leaned back in that expensive leather chair like he owned the whole building, like he already owned everything in the world, and said, "I read enough." The lawyer nodded once. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I watched my son's face go from confident to confused to something I had never seen on him before, something close to terror. I had seen that face when he was 7 years old and broke my shop window with a baseball. I had seen it when he was 19 and crashed my truck into a ditch. But this was different. This was the face of a man who had built his entire future on a foundation he never bothered to check. 3 days earlier, he had changed the locks on my house. The house I had built with my own hands. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I am and how I got here before you can understand what happened next. My name is Walter Greer. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years building a landscaping and property maintenance business from a single pickup truck and a used mower I bought at an auction outside of Columbus, Ohio. My wife Carol and I worked that business together from the very first season. She answered phones from our kitchen table. She did the bookkeeping every Sunday night while I watched football. She packed lunches for the crew. She drove supply runs when I was short-handed. Carol was not just my wife, she was my partner in every sense of the word. And every dollar Greer Property Services ever made had her fingerprints on it just as much as mine. By the time I turned 60, the business was worth somewhere around $4 million. We had contracts with 3 county school districts, 2 hospital campuses, a network of apartment complexes across central Ohio, and a seasonal snow removal division that alone brought in over $600,000 a year. We had 18 full-time employees and a fleet of 12 vehicles. We were not wealthy by the standards of people who summer on the Cape, but we had built something real, something that started from nothing. We had one child, our son, Marcus. He was 38 years old when all of this happened, and I say this not with anger but with a sadness that I still carry. Marcus had never once worked a full season in the business. He had done summers in high school, complained every day, and left for college with a business degree plan that turned into a marketing degree that turned into a series of jobs he couldn't keep for more than 2 years at a time. When he married his wife, Renata, I thought maybe she would settle him down. She was sharp and organized and spoke with the kind of confidence that made people listen. But over the years, I came to understand that what Renata was sharp about was opportunity. And the opportunity she had been waiting for was us. Carol was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March. By September, she was gone. I will not spend much time on those 6 months because that grief belongs to me and I am not ready to put it on a page. What I will tell you is that during those months, Marcus and Renata came around more than they had in years. They helped with appointments. They brought food. They sat with Carol on her good days. At the time, I was grateful. I was so exhausted and so heartbroken that I interpreted their presence as love. What I did not know what Carol knew, and what she did not tell me until 3 weeks before she passed, was that Marcus had been asking her, separately, privately, about the will. Carol told me this on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was coming through the bedroom window in that golden September way that made everything look peaceful even when it wasn't. She took my hand and she said, "Walter, I need to tell you something and I need you to not react right now. I need you to just listen." She told me that Marcus had come to her in July when I was at a supplier meeting and sat beside her bed and asked her, gently at first and then less gently, how the estate was structured. He wanted to know if the business would pass directly to him. He wanted to know if my name was on the primary accounts. He wanted to know, in his own careful words, whether there would be complications in accessing the assets quickly. Carol did not tell him anything, but she called our attorney, David Weston, the next morning. She had already updated her portion of the estate documents 3 weeks before Marcus came to her room. But after that conversation, she called David and spent 2 hours on the phone going through every scenario. When she was done, she had restructured everything. She did not tell me the details then. She said she wanted me to be surprised. She smiled when she said that. Even then, even at the end, she could find something to smile about. She told me only 2 things. First, that she had made sure I would be taken care of no matter what happened. Second, that she had made sure Marcus could not take anything that wasn't earned. "Trust David," she said, "and don't react when they read it. Let them talk first." I did not fully understand what she meant until the day of the reading. Carol passed on a Thursday. We buried her on a Monday. By Wednesday, Marcus and Renata had already asked me twice when the estate reading was scheduled. The reading was set for the following Tuesday at David's office in downtown Columbus. I drove myself. Marcus and Renata arrived in a new car I hadn't seen before, a black SUV with dealer plates, which told me something I filed away quietly. David read through the standard portions first. Carol's personal belongings, her jewelry, her accounts, a portion designated to her sister in Phoenix, a portion to her church, a portion to a literacy nonprofit she had volunteered with for 11 years. Then David paused and looked at Marcus directly. The remainder of Mrs. Greer's estate interest, including her 50% partnership stake in Greer Property Services, her equity position in the joint property at 4814 West Haven Drive, and her interest in the joint investment accounts, totaling approximately $4.3 million. These assets do not transfer directly. Marcus said, "What does that mean? Don't transfer directly?" David continued without changing his tone. "Mrs. Greer has placed these assets into the Carol Ann Greer Family Trust. Your father, Walter Greer, is the sole trustee and sole beneficiary of this trust for the duration of his lifetime. Upon your father's passing, the remaining trust assets will be distributed as follows: 60% to you, Marcus, contingent on certain conditions, and 40% to the Greer Family Foundation, a charitable entity your mother established last August." Marcus leaned forward. "Contingent on what conditions?" David slid a copy of the trust document across the table. "The conditions are outlined in Section 7. In summary, your inheritance is contingent on your having maintained an active, good-faith working relationship with Greer Property Services for a minimum of 3 consecutive years prior to your father's passing. Active is defined within the document. There is also a conduct clause." Renata, who had been quiet until that moment, said, "A conduct clause?" "Yes. Any action taken to diminish, encumber, alienate, or interfere with your father's use and enjoyment of trust assets, including but not limited to his primary residence, his vehicles, his business operations, or his financial accounts will result in automatic forfeiture of the contingent inheritance. The forfeited portion would then pass entirely to the foundation." The room was very quiet. Marcus said, "So what do I get now?" David looked at him evenly. "Nothing. At this time. The trust assets remain with your father." I watched my son's jaw tighten. I watched Renata place her hand on his arm in a way that was not comforting, it was communicating. They had a conversation in that touch that I could read clearly, even though no words were spoken. We drove home separately. Marcus and Renata came inside for less than 20 minutes. Marcus was controlled, but his eyes were somewhere I did not recognize. Renata walked through the rooms with her arms folded, looking at things the way people look at things they believe should belong to them. They left without saying much. I thought perhaps they needed time. I thought perhaps they would process it and come around. Carol had always believed that Marcus had good in him underneath everything, and I had always deferred to her judgment on that because she knew him in ways I didn't. So I waited. I waited 2 days. On Thursday morning, I woke up and went to start my truck and found that someone had moved it out of the garage and parked it at the end of the driveway, partially blocking the mailbox. That was unusual. I had not moved it. I went back inside and found a note on the kitchen counter. It was in Renata's handwriting, which I recognized from Christmas cards over the years. It said that she and Marcus had discussed things and felt it was best if I considered transitioning to a more appropriate living situation, as the house was large for one person, and they were prepared to help me find something suitable. It said they had already spoken with a realtor. It said that the business needed fresh leadership and that Marcus was prepared to step in immediately. It said that fighting the trust would only result in legal costs for everyone, and suggested that a cooperative approach would be better for the family. At the bottom, in Marcus's handwriting, was a single line. It said, "Dad, this is just the practical thing. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." I read that note twice. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. I called David Weston. David listened to everything. Then he asked me to take photographs of the note, the truck's position, and anything else that seemed out of place. He said he would send a letter by end of day. He also said something that Carol had apparently already discussed with him. There was a provision in the trust that allowed for emergency protective measures if the trustee's residence or assets were interfered with. David had prepared the filing already. He said Carol had specifically asked him to have it ready. My wife had known. She had prepared for this exact moment months before it happened. I sat in my kitchen that morning and I felt grief and love so tangled together I could not separate them. The following morning, I discovered that Marcus had called my operations manager, a man named Terry who had worked for me for 14 years, and told him that there was going to be a leadership transition at Greer Property Services, and that he, Marcus, would be the point of contact going forward. Terry called me within the hour, confused and loyal, asking what he should do. I told him to do nothing, and that I would handle it. That afternoon, I drove to the business office and found that Marcus had already had new signage printed small, just desk placards, but they said Marcus Greer, Director of Operations. They were stacked in a box by the front door. I picked up one of those placards. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about Carol packing lunches in the parking lot of a school contract because we couldn't afford a catering order. I thought about the February I worked a snow emergency for 61 hours straight, and she brought me coffee in the truck at 3 in the morning and sat with me until the roads were clear. I thought about every single thing we had built and every single year it had cost us. I set the placard back in the box. Then I called David again and told him to proceed with everything. What happened next moved faster than I expected, and I will tell you now that I had nothing to do with the timing. Carol had set it up. David executed it. I simply watched. David's protective filing triggered a legal hold on any business decisions Marcus had attempted to initiate. The county records showed that Marcus had also filed paperwork attempting to add his name to the business operating license, a move that David's hold froze immediately. The trust documentation was ironclad. David had spent hours with Carol making sure of that. Marcus called me that evening. He was not calm this time. He said I was being selfish. He said Carol would have wanted them to be involved. He said the business needed someone younger and that I was going to run it into the ground. He said Renata had contacts that could grow the company. He said a lot of things, and I listened to all of them. And when he was finished, I said one sentence. Marcus, your mother wrote this, not me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she wasn't thinking clearly at the end. I hung up. 3 days later, my son showed up at the house with Renata and a man I did not know who turned out to be a lawyer they had hired. They sat in my living room, the living room Carol had painted herself the summer of 2019, the one with the bookshelves she had built from reclaimed wood. And this lawyer explained that they intended to contest the trust on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. I let him finish his full presentation. Then I asked him a single question. Are you familiar with David Weston? The lawyer paused. I know of him. David began working on this trust structure in early July, 4 months before my wife passed. She was assessed by 2 physicians during that period, both of whom documented full cognitive capacity. She met with David 4 separate times. She requested a provision specifically requiring independent witness signatures on each amendment, and she required that a licensed clinical psychologist sign a capacity statement, which is on file. I paused. David mentioned you might try this. He said to tell you that the documentation is thorough. The other lawyer looked at his folder. He looked at Marcus. Something passed between them. They left within the hour. Now I want to tell you about the 5th day, because that is the day everything shifted in a way I had not expected. I was at the office early, reviewing the winter contract renewals with Terry, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local, so I picked up. It was a woman named Sandra Okafor. She said she was the facilities director for Meridian Health System, which was our largest single contract, almost $400,000 annually. She had seen something online. Marcus and Renata, in what I can only describe as a miscalculation born from desperation, had spent the previous 2 days telling anyone in their professional network that they were taking over Greer Property Services and looking for investors to fund an expansion. They had posted about it. They had sent emails. They had positioned themselves as the new leadership of a business they had no legal standing in. Sandra Okafor had received one of those emails. She called me to verify. I told her the truth. I told her there had been a family dispute following my wife's passing, that I remained the sole operating owner and trustee, and that no transition of any kind was occurring. I thanked her for calling me directly. She said, "Mr. Greer, I am sorry about your wife, and I want you to know we renewed because of what you and Carol built. The team, the reliability, the consistency. That's why we stayed for 11 years. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't changing." I told her it was not. After I hung up, I sat in the office that Carol and I had built together, in a chair she had picked out, looking at a framed photo on the wall of our crew from the first year we won the school district contract. Carol was in that photo, standing beside me in a parking lot, squinting into the sun, laughing at something someone had said. She was wearing a fleece vest and holding a clipboard, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had built something real and intended to protect it. Marcus called me that evening. Renata called twice. I did not pick up. The following morning, Marcus came to the house alone. He did not bring the lawyer. He did not bring Renata. He knocked on the front door and waited, which was the first time in years he had knocked instead of walked in. I opened the door. He looked like he had not slept. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like a person instead of a position. He looked like my son. He said, "Dad, I need help." I looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, the yard was still green, the last green of the season before the cold set in, and the maples Carol had planted along the driveway were turning that deep orange red she had always loved most. I said, "I know you do." Renata's contact at the investment group they pulled out when the trust thing came out, and the email thing. With Meridian, she's upset. She's saying, "I misrepresented everything." "You did misrepresent everything." He looked at the ground. "I know. You told my operations manager there was a transition. You printed signage. You filed paperwork with the county. You called my clients." "I know, Dad. Your mother built this with me. She built it with her hands and her time, and she was doing bookkeeping the week she came home from her second surgery. Did you know that? She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her reading glasses, and she did the payroll because she didn't want Terry to have to wait." My voice held. "I made sure of it. She knew what you were going to do, Marcus. That's why she did what she did. She wasn't punishing you. She was protecting what we built." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Is there any way to fix this?" I told him the truth, which was that I did not know. I told him that the trust was not something that could be renegotiated, because it wasn't mine to renegotiate. It was Carol's, and she had made her intentions clear. I told him that the conduct clause had likely already been triggered by what he and Renata had attempted, and that David would have to assess the full picture. I told him that if there was any path forward, it would be a long one. It would involve him actually working in the business, not directing it, not leading it, not putting his name on a placard, working in it, learning what Terry and the crew know, understanding what a school district contract requires in February at 4 in the morning. I told him I could not promise anything about the inheritance. What I could promise was that if he showed up, really showed up, I would not turn him away. He nodded. He didn't thank me. I didn't expect him to, not that day. Gratitude takes time to grow in soil that's been neglected for a long time. He went back to his car and sat there for a few minutes. Then he drove away. I closed the front door and stood in the hallway of my house, the one Carol painted and furnished and filled with 31 years of a life, and I breathed. I did not feel victorious. I want to be honest about that. There is a version of this story where the father savors the moment, where the karma lands like a thunderclap, and everything feels resolved and bright. That is not what I felt. What I felt was tired and sad and fiercely, quietly proud of a woman who had loved us both enough to plan for our worst selves, even while she was running out of time. She had known. She had made calls and signed documents and thought through contingencies while she was sick, while she was tired, while she was in pain. She had done all of that, so that what she and I built would not be dismantled by someone who had never understood what it cost. That is the kind of person Carol Greer was. In the months that followed, I made some decisions of my own. I brought Terry on as a partial partner in the business, a move I had been considering for 2 years, and Carol had strongly encouraged before she passed. I hired 2 new crew leads. I renewed the Meridian contract and added a second hospital campus in the spring. Marcus came to the office in January. He did not come as a director. He came on a Tuesday morning in work clothes and asked Terry what needed to be done. Terry told me later that Marcus had not complained once all day, which Terry said was frankly remarkable. He came back on Thursday, then the following week. It is a slow thing, rebuilding something. I am not sure yet what it will become, but I know this. Carol was right. She was right about the trust, and she was right about something harder to put into legal language, which is that the things worth having are the things you earn. I still talk to her, not in a way I could explain to a doctor or a lawyer, just in the way you talk to someone you shared 37 years with, in the quiet of a house that still carries the shape of who she was. I tell her about the contracts, about Terry's new title, about Marcus showing up in January with his boots on. I think she already knew, but I tell her anyway. If you are a parent watching this tonight, I want to say something directly to you. Not as advice, because I am not qualified to advise anyone about their family, just as a man who has lived through it. The things you build, the real things, the ones that cost you early mornings and hard winters, and every version of yourself you had to become to get there, those things deserve protection. Not from the world, from the people who believe they are entitled to the result without the process. Carol understood that better than I did. She understood it so well that she protected all of us, me, the business, and even Marcus from the version of him that didn't know better yet. I don't know if he'll get there. I hope he does. I hope that one February morning, years from now, when the crew is running a snow emergency and the phones are ringing and the trucks need to be dispatched, he'll understand in his body what it means to have built something. That's what I'm waiting for. That's what Carol was waiting for, too.